Is cultural property just about ancient artifacts in museums, or does it go way deeper than that? From looted treasures and colonial collections to repatriation battles and national pride, the debate over who really owns history is more complicated than it seems. In this episode of Untangle, we're breaking it all down, busting myths, clarifying misconceptions, and making sense of a topic that's often wrapped in controversy. So buckle up. We're about to make cultural property less confusing and a whole lot more interesting. I'm Amadi Nobewe, and this is Untangle. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is still Untangle, and we're breaking down the issue of cultural property. We have an expert in the house. She is the Director of Arts at the African School of Economics, talking about Aisha Aliyu Bima. She joins us now to do justice to this issue, to break it down. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
It's good
I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for coming again. Last time it was quite enlightening, and we thought we could do it again to educate people on what's really going on. So, cultural property. It seems like just two regular words put together, but I don't know. For someone who might not really be aware, what would we say is actually cultural property?
So cultural property is simply a tangible object that represents a people and their culture and their belief. It could be their belief system, it could be whatever, but as long as it's a tangible object that is representative of a people, a culture, that is cultural property.
So does it have to be physical?
Most of the time, although sometimes there are untangible cultural properties, but those are very often few and far between. Yeah.
All right. So I think, even in my introduction, the main issue here is property indicates ownership. So how does a culture own something? At what point do we say, okay, this thing belongs to this group of people and it is theirs?
Usually from origin, although we have interesting things like Ankara, for example, which is not African in origin, but it has become African in usage and representation. So yes, you then find like very complicated issues like that, but usually it's defined by how people accept it, how they use it, when it has become part of a culture, part of the practice, and it is representative of a people. When you see it, it represents those people. When you see it, it represents those cultures. When people from those cultures see it, they feel familiar, they understand what it is, then it is their cultural property.
All right. Before we go back, I just need to draw you back a bit because what you said was a bit interesting.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say Ankara wasn't originally African?
Ankara is the Dutch wax print. It was brought to Africa by, I believe, the Dutch, and which they sort of developed together with Malaysians and Indonesians in that region because the Dutch colonized a part of that region. And then they brought those fabrics to Africa for trade, and we began to purchase them.
Is that why it's called Hollandies sometimes?
Well, yes, because one of the biggest producers was Holland, of course. Yes, and then, many different producers began to spring up. And we also began to make changes. When they saw there was a demand, they began to change the motifs to represent our culture. We also began to have our people design their own motifs and, demand production of those. So it does have a very long history, but in terms of origin, it is not fabric that we started here. Our more traditional fabrics would be the akwete, the saki, the ashoke. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I think it also kind of exemplifies how culture is for people and maybe not always the way around.
Yeah.
Does it mean when something comes and it becomes generally in use for a while, it can now be said to be part of that culture or owned by them, so to speak?
Yes. Although I think it's always very important, especially in these days, because culture is something that moves. There's always an exchange of culture between people around the world. It has been there from time. So there are many things that originated in a certain place but ended up being culturally representative of somewhere else. Coffee, for example, when we think of coffee, we very often think of Europeans and Westerners, but coffee is something that originated in the Middle East. And, it's something that is is very culturally significant there. But yeah, it has been embraced worldwide. Many different varieties have sprung up. Yeah, so culture travels, it moves, but I think it's always very important to acknowledge the history of where it's coming from and why we've embraced it. Another very interesting one is jollof rice, for example. You know, you ask people.
You've entered a controversial topic there. So let's say what's blockbusting about that?
I mean, you ask people, every Nigerian, what is Nigerian food? They would very often tell you jollof rice. You ask a Ghanaian.
Are they wrong?
I mean, they're right in the sense that we have adopted it. It has become our national meal. But maybe our great-grandparents would not have really considered jollof rice something that was theirs, right? But it's something that has a history in West Africa, all the way from Senegal, the Senegambia region, and then spreading. And we have so many iterations of it across Nigeria, Ghana, and many other West African countries. So yeah,
I would like to very much claim that, but you know, again, we should be concerned about history and how things develop. So before we go any further into some specific issues now, can you give us some actual examples of what cultural property is, so that we can now jump up from there as to some of the issues we have now?
Yes, I think maybe when we're talking about cultural property without any ambiguity, we begin to talk about our cultural objects. In Nigeria, for example, the Benin bronzes, the Nok terracotta, the Iboku pottery, and all of that, the Ife bronzes as well. So those objects are objects that were created by our ancestors, that have a huge cultural relevance, that in a way even define Nigerian history and the cultural exchange that has existed prior to that. Ones that are still very often in use, that we still have possession of, the masquerade garments, for example. So all of those things are examples of cultural property.
All right. So I think some part of my question now could be, you know, at what points, or is it just mass production of these things, or is it the ones that are rare that cause some controversy? Take, for instance, we're having many countries now trying to get back some of these cultural properties. So one might say now, for instance, in Benin, if I recall, I think it's Igun Market in Edo State right there. There is a whole place where they'll sell bronzes. It's still active to this day. And one might wonder, I mean, you have all of this here. Why are you fighting for one that is abroad, you know? So what gives it that relevance?
So the case of Benin is very unique. I'm going to give a quick history lesson. There was something interesting that happened in Benin, which was the British actually came and ransacked Benin and went into the palaces and took away bronzes from the palaces. Yes, it is true that bronze casting method in Benin still exists till this day. You can still find people to cast in exactly the same way that those bronzes that were taken were cast. But it is that the British came, they destroyed the city, the Great Walls of Benin. Many of us do not even know how large the Great Walls of Benin were, but this was a massive city, a well-built city, a structured city, and they sort of ground it into rubble, and they took everything and they put it in their museums that we now have to pay to access. And that is why when we talk about the Benin bronzes, it's very important to bring them back. But beyond the Benin bronzes, you also have, for example, the Nok terracotta. And the very interesting thing about Nok is that this was a civilization that existed in the middle of Nigeria, very broad, from Sokoto all the way down to the Benue. You know, it was a massive civilization. Over 2,000 years ago, it disappeared. Many years later, excavations were going on and they discovered these pots. And then they took the best samples of like the terracottas, and we did not have access to them. Me, for example, with all of my interest in art and with all of my love for the art, and even growing up in the city of Jos, the first time I was able to see a great example of a Nok terracotta was outside of Nigeria, because the pictures in our arts textbooks were blurry. So yeah, it's things like these. And we ask to we ask for these things back because they help us understand one another. When you place the Nok terracotta and you place the Ife terracotta and you place Iboku pottery and you place the Benin bronzes together, you can sort of see almost a line of evolution that exists between these. And it just shows that these are cultures that we see today have been interacting with one another long before the idea of Nigeria came. You know, whenever you talk about Nigeria, there's often the predisposition for people to say, well, the British just lumped us all together. But prior to them, we must have been
There was
communicating.
some connection.
We must have been. And so this is very important to our present history. It does not have as much of a relevance to them except for upholding the idea of their empire and the success of their empire. And this is something that they took from us. And I think at every point in time, we have the right to demand those things back, especially when they've made a lot of money off of it because they have it in these museums that you have to pay to access. You have to apply for visas to go to their countries to see what is yours. Yeah, I think that's why the conversation around reparations is very important and very
key. Yeah, indeed. And I was going to ask, what is in it for them? But you've already broken it down because one would wonder. I mean, don't you have your own history to an extent? But I think they place some exoticness on the history of others and basically having the power to display them. But I think another question is how do you see that progressing? Because we do see some returns being made and so on and so forth. So is it how do I put it now? These museums that have these things over there, getting them back here, what then is the next step? And also, I think we already touched on it a little bit. The things we're talking about, you mentioned 2,000 years ago and so on. What about things of today? If the British came today, how would that go? Maybe the issue now will be about consent, which is another question I'm curious about. If I have this cultural property and someone comes to meet me and says, I want that and I'll pay you for it, and I say, okay, and I collect the funds, what has happened there? Do we still have right to say we need it back?
I mean, there's always a conversation about power dynamics and wealth dynamics that exists, right? If I have a full understanding of what my property is and I understand its value and you come to me and we do a fair exchange, that is balanced, that is great, that is fair. I mean, in these days, as you rightfully said, there's a lot of archiving. We're able to put down the history of materials. For a lot of the cultural objects that we have today, the talking drum, the kakaki, for example, they're very well documented. No one can come and take it anymore and sort of try to erase the history and say maybe, as we've seen in some cases where some historians even tried to claim that some of the objects must have been created by aliens because there's no way these primitive Africans could have been able to make objects of this detail or objects of this quality. So in these days, we do not have so much of that. And again, because we're able to have a deeper understanding of what we have, we're able to make fair exchanges. And it's not that it's a bad thing for cultures to share their material or to, exchange it around the world. We can see something interesting from Brazil, from the Amazon, and actually ask them, oh, this is so interesting. We would love to loan these materials and put them in museums in Nigeria so that we can learn more about your culture. That is wonderful. That is what we're advocating. But for you to take possession, especially as was done in terms of empires, the British, the French, all of these colonial powers coming and taking these materials without consent, some of the materials which have massive spiritual, religious significance, and then taking them away and now forcing, like, again, the Benin bronzes, which are a wonderful example, because when they went into these palaces, these were ritual items, these were items of religion, these were items of cultural power, not just day-to-day objects. And for them to take them away, it's a very, big crime.
All right. So I guess the question now is the arguments. What is the argument from their side of it? Because it seems very straightforward. You took something of mine, I want it back. We just expect, okay, oh, sorry, we're sending it tomorrow. But this conversation has dragged for decades, and now there's this talk of, is there a case to be made here for shared custody? Has this stayed so long with these people that they can now say that we have equal rights to this?
I mean, it is legally a very complicated situation. For me, I think, and for many people in Nigeria, and even interestingly enough, due to a lot of the work that historians, curators, and all have been doing in the West, it's a clear-cut thing. It doesn't belong to you, return it. But when you look at the history of empire and what they've taken, and then in the ways that the world has changed post-empire, so with the collapse of the British Empire, with the French, for example, they created laws where objects that have been acquired by French museums can never be sold or returned. They can only be loaned back. So that becomes complicated because for them, it might mean a question of changing the entire French constitution to allow return of those items. You also have critics of the repatriation movement who say, well, you know, we took them, but we were able to preserve them. Perhaps if we had left them, we would not have the capacity to preserve them.
That sounds racist to me.
Indeed, it really is. At the same time, you have a lot of people here in Nigeria doing the work, building capacity to allow us actually take back those items and even preserve them even better than they were being done there. And even in Nigeria, you also have issues with the Benin bronzes, for example. A common sort of legal battle or quagmire that we encounter is you have the Benin royal family saying, well, these are back, they are ours. And the Nigerian government now saying, well, no, they are Nigeria's property, not the property of the... So yeah, in that sort of way, in that series of cultural custodianship, you would encounter a lot of like legal battles that would have to be fought. But I think ultimately we're all rooting for the return of every single...
Indeed. As a Benin boy myself, I wouldn't like to give out my opinion, but I think anyone who knows knows where I should probably stand. But that being said, we'll go on a quick break now. When we return, we'll delve more into cultural property and basically break it down further. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, let's face it, our world today experiences numerous challenges. And guess what? Our community isn't off the hook either. Most of the world issues are either not talked about enough or never talked about at all. But here on Timeline, we've got you covered. We dive deep into issues that affect us every day, leaving behind footprints of wisdom, knowledge, and solutions. Think of it like a roadmap that keeps you on the track for success. So buckle up, because in this new season of Timeline, we're taking another trip through the past, the present, and navigate into a more promising future. Again, we're talking solutions, people. And let's make one thing clear. This is not your average blah, blah, blah convo. This is real talk with a side of inspiration and a sprinkle of wow. I never thought about it like that. I'm your host on this impactful ride. Together, we'll tackle the tough stuff, laugh a little, and find ourselves on the path to positive change. So what are you waiting for? Season 2 of Timeline will be loaded. Let's get started. Hop in, and let's drive straight into the heart of issues shaping our world. Let's go. Oh, one more thing. Hit that subscribe button and let's take this ride together.
Every day, amazing stories of hope and tenacity unfold across the globe. On Hued Hour, we dive into these inspiring tales and discuss the vital work being done in the humanitarian and development space. Humanity has never faced a shortage of challenges, yet we rise stronger through teamwork and determination. Though these remedies are often underreported, on Hued Hour, we advocate sustainable solutions. We bring you the latest and most impactful news on how lives are being changed. We engage with young change makers and experts who provide valuable insights into relief efforts and the challenges faced by local communities through a global perspective. Join us every Wednesday by 8 a.m. on Hued Network's YouTube channel as we embark on this journey of positive change. Welcome back. We're still on the issue of cultural property and all that has to do with it. So I guess moving on now, Aisha, the question I want to move on to is when it comes to the issue of ownership, proof. How do countries prove it? Is that an issue in contention at all? When someone says this belongs to me and I need it back, then can there be a question of how do you know it really belongs to you?
I mean, thankfully, very often with a lot of the modern properties that we're able to see in museums and, in institutions around the world, there's good providence. So providence is the art of, or the process of tracing the history of an object and where it was excavated from and all of that. But once in a while, because again of the way colonialism worked and the way colonial borders were drawn, you could have excavated something in an area that's today modern day Nigeria, but in the past it was Niger, or it belonged to Chad, or it's even a contentious region like Bakassi. So sometimes we have issues like that where Cameroon can say, well, we want this back, and Nigeria says we want that back. And usually you can just have some sort of conversations or sometimes a legal battle to determine the provenance of that material and the relevance. And you've also had cultures sort of move. People that we consider Hausa today, or the Hausa of today, were not the Hausa of 10,000 or even 2,000 years ago. So it's always but I mean, there are ways to sort of resolve it and try to trace the history of the material all the way to carbon dating. We've had people doing carbon dating of the materials, X-rays, doing chemical analysis of the material versus the soil, in the region to try. So there are ways to resolve it.
All right, so you mentioned colonial rule. What's the link there, would you say, between colonial rule and cultural property?
Colonialism did change a lot quickly in Africa, especially in the ways that we lived. With some of our objects, they made them seem redundant. They taught us that these were not valuable anymore. This was not good religion, discard it. And then they took away all these objects to go and display in their museum after conditioning people to not see the value in it. At the same time, colonialism basically meant they had ownership of our land. So they were able to go into the land and dig and excavate and dig up artifacts, like in the case of the Nok terracotta. Colonialism also meant sort of trying to dominate, to conquer people. And that was what happened in the case of Benin, where they went into Benin, they ransacked the city, they took whatever they found valuable, whatever they found beautiful, and they took it away. So it was the driving force behind like all of this loss of cultural property that we have today.
That's fair enough. So does the issue of war also play a part in what happens with cultural property?
Yes, indeed, because war is one of the biggest destroyers of cultural property. More recently, in Timbuktu, we've had a lot of insurgency in the Sahel in the past 2 decades. And one of the things, Timbuktu was a famed land for research, for knowledge spreading. So you have a lot of manuscripts of inestimable historical value, a lot of archives of knowledge in Timbuktu. And what you found with insurgency was that some of these insurgents were coming into these places that held these manuscripts and setting them on fire. They were destroying objects of immense cultural value. And so war does play a part in the preservation or even in the exchange of cultural property, because we've also seen it in some of the most contentious situations in the world, Israel, Palestine, where you have a war, a country comes, it takes cultural property and it insists that that property belongs to it because it won the war. So we do have situations like that.
All right. When I spoke about proving ownership, are there cases where actually maybe in the real sense of it, this cultural property is actually shared between two cultures in a manner of speaking?
Yes, very often. As I said, culture changes, right? a lot of times when people belong to the same civilization, they all become those people. So like in the Great Benin Empire, everybody under the Great Benin Empire was a Benin man. But now you have a lot of, you would know better, Benin, Esako, all of that.
Ishan,
and Ishan. And the same thing with, for example, the area of like the Nok civilization. Today, that area has broken down into over 100 and something tribes. You have everyone from the Hausas to the Ham to the Tiv, Idoma, Birom, all of these ethnic groups, all of them.
So they all have ownership.
Yes, they all have ownership of that property. And in a way, they're all happy to share it, of course, with the custodians being the people where those terracottas were first discovered. Yeah, so you have a lot of examples. Even with Egypt, for example, we know the pyramids most popularly in Egypt, although Sudan also had way more pyramids than even Egypt. And that entire area of Egypt and Sudan was what was ancient Egypt. So they do share a lot of the artifacts and a lot of the properties amongst themselves. Yeah.
Right, so what happens when these properties or artifacts are destroyed or looted and all of that?
I mean, with destruction, it's very unfortunate because many, many times, unless there's good documentation, it means that it is gone forever. There's no way to bring it back. But in cases where, for example, with some of the manuscripts that were digitized, we have access to digital versions of it. With VR, with 3D reconstruction, sometimes with the monuments that were demolished, you're able to have but when they're destroyed, they're gone. When they're looted, on the other hand, sometimes it might take many years. Even with again, the Nok terracotta, some of the more Nigerian objects of cultural heritage, we discover many of them that are outside museums, outside the institutions we're able to talk to. It's usually when some old white guy, maybe in Wisconsin, dies, and then his children are going through his property and they're like, oh, well, dad had this, and then they start going, what is the value? And then that's how we discover that, oh, this item, and even within Europe, you find a lot of that. Like with World War II, a lot of the properties exchanged hands, and that's why they're always discovering paintings that were stolen during World War II, and it was originally a Polish painting, but it's discovered many years later in France, many years later in Canada, many years later in even China. Yeah.
Before we go further, I'd like to know, in the first place, or perhaps in the main part of it, when these cultural properties, if they belong or are held by the original owners, how does that look really? Is it something where, if it's taken abroad, they put it in museums and people go and look at it? Take, for instance, now, if the Benin bronzes were returned and let's say the palace took hold of it, we understand that there's some parts of our culture that has this sort of closed-off nature to it. You mustn't come close to this. Even the other day, we saw some proclamation from the palace talking about certain wares shouldn't be used by everyone. It's for, mostly for the royal family and some royal persons and all of that. So I'd like to know how or in your experience, these things, how are they shared, if that's the right word, amongst the people who originally own it?
I think that is a decision for the people that have ownership of it to make. So in the case of the Benin, for example, if this is something that is sacred to them, there is no, just because it has been displayed by people that have sort of bastardized that sacredness, it doesn't mean that when it is returned, they do not still consider it sacred and it shouldn't return to that sacred form. But as we know, culture is something that evolves, but that decision can only be made by people within the culture. When the items are returned, the Oba of Benin can today decide that these items are no longer, or they've been sort of, the sacredness around it has been gotten rid of, so they want to publicly display it in the palace, or they want to go into agreement with the Nigerian government to present it in the museum. But I do think that it is a decision that has to be made in tandem with the people in that culture and with the declared custodians of that culture. That's
fair enough. I think it's an interesting one. It actually also goes to the fact that culture is something real. It's not just for display. So if this is how it was, I can understand it going back to that level. So in this case now, what you've already mentioned the issue with France, but I'd like to know more how international laws affect all of this. When it comes to cultural property, are there any things in place that kind of protect it or thereabouts? And also, is there even a case for any of this cultural property being stolen or taken still happening in this day and age? I can understand destruction perhaps in the middle of a war, but I'm trying to imagine in this day and age, do we still have any of that?
Yes, indeed, we still have many of that because, for example, some of these artifacts are still being discovered till this day, especially, again, the ones from the much older cultures where you have to excavate before you find them. We still have black market traders who discover these items and they try to sell it, through the back door without going through legal processes. Because if you go through legal processes, for example, in Nigeria, you would not be able, you present those items to the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, and they know how to handle it and to display it or to loan it to other museums. It is Nigeria's property. But you have people who want to make money off of it and they go on the black market and they smuggle these items out of the country and they sell it to willing collectors around the world. But thankfully, Nigeria has laws to prevent that. There are a lot of measures. In fact, even a contemporary painting now, you cannot take it out of Nigeria without getting the right documentation and the right permit. So we've taken a lot of steps to protect that. And also, thankfully, as well, with a lot of the conversation around reparations and cultural property globally, many countries have laws to prevent exit and entry of illegal items into their country. But of course, the black market, things like that always exist.
So is there any other thing those people should know, or perhaps people who sell or buy this, is there something they should know about what they are in possession of?
Yes, I think they should know that when you take these items away from the people that they belong to, you're severing a bond. You're taking something of huge cultural significance. You're preventing a child from learning about who they are. And when you prevent someone from learning about who they are, you're inadvertently affecting where they're going to, right? You're preventing them from getting that understanding. You're taking ancestral wisdom. Maybe you just keep it in your house and look at it for beauty. But when people are able to look at this thing and they have familiarity to the culture, sometimes they're even able to unlock knowledge. We've had processes where archaeologists who have studied something for over 50 years have been trying to decipher an object. They take it back to that region, and one old woman looks at it and she's like, oh, this means this. Because she has seen it, it was something common to her, and that knowledge was almost lost. So you're taking away the ability of interpretation from the people that are most familiar with it. It is special when you want to learn about other cultures and you're able to come to those cultures and learn from them and display that knowledge. But when you take it to just turn it into an object of beauty in your place without going through the proper processes, then it's unfortunate. And you don't get half of the satisfaction you would if you actually learned.
That's true, really. Getting it from the source and having that respect, which sometimes is the question of cultural appreciation and appropriation. So what would you say is the difference there, really?
It's very simple. Appropriation is when you try to claim something from another culture without going through the due process, and you claim it immediately for yours. You come to Benin, you learn how to cast Benin bronzes, and you go to France and you say, wow, I've discovered this bronze casting technique. This is my technique. And you give it your own name. Or even when people try to allude that, oh, this could be Benin, you're like, no, this is my thing. Appreciation is when you learn and you go and you say, oh, look, I'm doing my works in this way because I went to Benin, I learned, I'm doing it in the Benin tradition of bronze casting. Or when you wear a fabric and you say, wow, I'm wearing this beautiful Nigerian print fabric. I'm wearing this ashoke from Nigeria, or I've made this new item with ashoke fabric from Nigeria. That's appreciation. You're giving credit to the place that you learned it from or the culture that you learned it from. But appropriation is just sort of whitewashing the identity or the original influence of what you're creating.
Okay, so just two final questions that I want to bundle together now. How do you think local communities can protect their cultural property? And second of all, in your own experience, what would you say is actually the biggest or some of the biggest misconceptions as regards this issue of cultural property?
this how can local communities preserve their culture? I just last week was very privileged to see one of the most wonderful examples of that. A foundation from the Nok community in Kaduna State, Weham Foundation, who have been doing a lot of work on preserving the Nok terracottas, on creating documentaries about Nok terracotta and educating people, got a $90,000 grant from the US Embassy, which they're going to execute in partnership with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments to sort of advance this work that they're doing in preserving culture, in teaching people about Nok terracotta, and even training museum staff and museum curators in handling and preservation of all of these artifacts. And that is a great example of when people in a community rise up and say, look, we can do something to bring back what is ours. They started from making a documentary, that they shared, and this documentary enabled them to get access to grants that allowing them to do so much more work. And it's a foundation that was started by someone in the community. It's supported by the leaders of the community, the rulers. All of the traditional leadership have really rallied around, and I think it's such a great example of people in the community preserving their work. I would also say the Museum of West African Art in Benin is a very good example, all the way from the construction, using rammed earth techniques to build the museum, all the way into the way they're reimagining repatriation of works and the presentation of works. It's really brilliant work of when you have people in a community actually taking charge and leading. So I would say the best way is for you, every single person in a community, to look at what do you feel connected to in your community and how can you talk about it? How can you encourage people that are doing the work to either return or even to preserve? You see someone maybe tossing a piece of pottery and it is something beautiful. You might not know the details of it, but you can reach out, you can send an email to the National Council for Museums and Monuments, and they would happily
That's fair enough and really interesting. So the question on misconceptions, are there any?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions that we find is that cultural properties are old and therefore not really useful. A lot of people think they are just old items that should be discarded, but they do not know that they're preserves of knowledge, a way that we can connect with the past. Sometimes a way to help us unravel the connections that we have. As I said, one of the triangular exchange that has always existed in Nigeria. Sometimes when you try to talk to people, they don't recognize it as much as when they see something and they all equally feel connected to it. It's also in the present day materials that we have. In Kano, a few years ago, a monument was demolished, and I think even the demolishers were just astounded at the uproar from the people living in Kano that sculpture was demolished, because they did feel connection to it. They felt that it represented them. And when you take representation away from people, it really changes the way they
taking their
interact
identity
with their...
to an extent.
Yes, you are. It changes the way they interact with their society. So I think that's the biggest misconception. And also that culture is not, we cannot create new cultures. So
that's a question. I was going to end on that. That's a personal question from me. When we talk about these things, it's usually historical. This thing happened back then. But then these people, while it was happening, they probably didn't think they were just living their lives, right? So my question is it really the case that we can't do something that ends up being cultural or create cultural properties maybe for the next 50 years or the next generation coming? Or is it that all we have to give them is artificial intelligence, and computers and all of that?
Oh no, we are creating new cultures. In every place when we decide to adapt as humans, we find things that have significance to us, right? And as I said, one of the biggest modern day examples that I would use is the Dutch wax print, or the Ankara as we now know it. We have taken it, we have sort of evolved it into something that is very ours, very representative of us. And there are many new things that Nigerians are coming up with. The pistol, the mortar and the pistol, in the way that we use it. When you trace the history of it, it's still quite new to us. Jollof rice, again, with its contentious, history, is still something relatively new to Nigeria. It became the Nigerian food around the 1970s. And so that is new culture. every single day in the way we sew our kaftans, for example. In the 2010s, we've brought out so many new types of kaftans that, have been inspired by the past, but are very new and authentic to us. And those are all our cultural properties.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I wish we had more time. I'll go into more, but it's been a pleasure and an enlightening episode. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It's
All right.
great conversation as
Thank you
always.
so much. All right, that's all we have today for cultural property. We have broken it down to as simple as it can get, and I think it's something where we get to sit back and meditate or think about the things that matter to us, what they mean to us as a people, as a culture, and again, knowing your past makes you know your history. So I do hope you had a lot to understand from this one. I personally am from Edo State. I'm a Benin boy, and I hold that very dearly. So do join us once again on Untangle here, where we break down issues. If you have any issue, concepts, news items that might be confusing you, that you need some untangling and breaking down, do leave them in the comment section. And next time, we just might come around and untangle it for you. See you next time. Bye for now. I am Amadine Obewe.